The estate was quiet in the way that only very large houses could be quiet, all that space pressing down on a single point of sound, and that point was Elena's son, awake again at 3 a.m. with the particular fury of a person who had not yet learned that the world did not reorganize itself around his hunger. She lifted him from the bassinet before the crying could fully build, moving on instinct now, the way her body had recalibrated itself in the 3 weeks since his birth, into something that operated on 40-minute intervals of sleep and the smell of warm milk, and the specific weight of a child who had not yet reached 8 pounds, but already understood how to make a room revolve around him. She settled into the chair by the window and let him find what he needed. And in the silence that followed, she looked out at the drive below, because there was nothing else to look at, and the city beyond. The estate walls was doing what cities did at this hour, burning quietly to itself with no concern for anyone inside. The car was there again, dark, parked just past the outermost gate, engine off, but positioned with the particular deliberateness of something that had not stopped there by accident. She had noticed it first 5 nights ago, told herself it was a neighbor or a late delivery, let the explanation settle over the unease, the way she had learned to let explanations settle over things she was not ready to examine. She had noticed it again 2 nights after that, same spot, same angle, and told herself coincidence, told herself the neighborhood had a rhythm she had not yet learned. But this was the 3rd time, and she was sitting in the dark at 3 a.m. with her son at her breast, and she was not going to tell herself coincidence again. She did not wake Adrian immediately. She watched the car for 20 minutes, and it did not move, and no one got in or out, and the lights never came on. Then she carried her son back to the bassinet, settled him with more ease than she had managed the previous week, and walked to Adrian's side of the bed and placed her hand on his shoulder with the steady pressure that she had learned, woke him cleanly rather than sharply. He was awake before she spoke. She had noticed this about him from early on, the way sleep seemed to sit lightly on him, like a coat he could remove at a touch. "There's a car," she told him quietly, "outside the far gate. It's been there before, 3 times now." He did not sit up immediately. He lay still for a breath longer than necessary, and she noticed that too, the small gap between the moment he understood what she was telling him and the moment he decided what to do with it. Then he rose, moved to the window without turning on any light, and looked for a long time without saying anything. "I see it," he told her. "Go back to sleep. I'll have Marcus run the plates." She waited for more. He offered nothing else, and his voice had a flatness to it that she associated with the version of him that was already several moves deep into a problem he had decided to handle before telling her about it. She went back to bed. She did not sleep. In the morning he told her the plates came back clean. A rental, probably a journalist who had picked up rumors about their son's birth and was trying to confirm the story. It was a reasonable explanation. It was the kind of explanation that arrived too quickly, too completely formed, and she filed it in the same drawer where she kept the memory of his silence the night before and the particular stillness of a man who already knew something he was not yet ready to share. She did not challenge him on it. She poured coffee and listened to him talk about the foundation call she had later that afternoon and made a note to herself that the drawer was getting full. Nikolai Volkov arrived at 11 that morning without calling ahead, which Adrian had told her once was simply how his brother operated, that Nikolai had never once, in his 42 years of life, believed a telephone call was necessary when a door existed. She was in the sitting room off the main hall, her son asleep in the carrier against her chest, going through the last of her father's estate documents with the particular concentration of someone trying to finish something they had been avoiding for months, when she heard the front door and then Adrian's voice and then another voice she did not recognize. When she appeared in the doorway, the man was already in the hall, taller than Adrian by 2 inches, but carrying it differently, less contained, with the loose, easy physicality of someone who had spent his life knowing every room would make space for him without being asked. He turned before Adrian could complete the introduction, and the smile he offered Elena was the kind that arrived in the eyes before it reached the mouth, warm and unhurried, and somehow already familiar. "You must be Elena," Nikolai Volkov observed, his voice carrying a faint trace of something that was not quite an accent but was not entirely absent of one either, the residue of a childhood split between two countries before New York claimed him. "I've been waiting to meet you for quite a long time. My brother, as you may have noticed, is not always forthcoming with information." He looked at the sleeping child against her chest with an expression that she would have described, if pressed, as genuinely moved, the softness of it landing before she had a chance to prepare herself for it. "And this must be him." Adrian made the introductions with the same ease he brought to everything in her presence, but she noted that he placed himself just slightly between her and Nikolai, not blocking, nothing so obvious, simply present in a way that occupied a specific point in the geography of the room. She noticed it the way she noticed most things she was not yet sure how to name. Nikolai accepted the placement without comment, as though he either had not registered it or had registered it and found it entirely predictable, and he directed his attention toward her son with a warmth that Elena found difficult to be suspicious of in the moment, even as something small and alert in her was already paying close attention. She invited him to stay for coffee because that was what you did, and because she wanted the time to watch him, and because Adrian would not send his brother away without a reason she had not yet given him. They sat in the kitchen rather than the formal sitting room, which had been her choice, and she observed how Nikolai moved through the space, easy and observant, the kind of man who catalogued rooms the way other people catalogued conversations. He asked about her work with the foundation, and he asked about her recovery, and he asked exactly the right questions and not too many of them, and she thought to herself that he was very good at this, whatever this was. Then he asked, leaning forward with the cup between his hands, "Have you settled on a name yet?" For him, and something shifted almost imperceptibly in the room. Adrian looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them had announced a name publicly. They had discussed names in this house, in low voices, in the particular privacy of two people who were still learning what they were to each other. She had not told her assistant. Adrian had not told Marcus. She was almost certain of it. She kept her expression neutral and told Nikolai they were still deciding, and watched his face absorb the answer with a smoothness that told her nothing, except that he was a man practiced at absorbing answers without revealing what he had expected to hear. He nodded and let the subject move on, and the conversation found other ground, and Elena refilled his coffee and asked him something about his years in Chicago, and the morning continued around the question she had just placed quietly to the side, where she intended to keep it until she understood it better. After Nikolai left, Adrian stood at the kitchen counter for a moment with his back to her, and she gave him that moment, and when he turned, his expression was the careful, composed one that she had learned to read as the exterior of something more complicated. "He means well," Adrian told her, with a conviction that was perhaps slightly too deliberate to be entirely effortless. "He's not good at distance. He never has been." She looked at her son, awake now, and regarding the ceiling with the philosophical intensity of someone encountering the concept of ceilings for the first time. "He knew the baby was a boy," Elena told Adrian, not accusingly, simply placing it in the air between them. "We didn't announce that either." Adrian was quiet for a moment. "I may have mentioned it," he told her, and she accepted the answer and said nothing further and put it in the drawer, and the drawer was now considerably fuller than it had been that morning. That night she fed her son at 2:47 in the morning and sat by the window again, and the car was not there. The road beyond the gate was empty and quiet and perfectly ordinary. She sat with her son until he drifted back, and she sat a while longer after that, watching the empty road, thinking about a man who had known a name that had not been given, and a car that appeared and disappeared on no schedule she could find the logic of, and a husband who had paused one breath too long before explaining both. The drawer in the back of her mind was full. She was going to have to open it soon. Nikolai came back on Wednesday with a small wooden horse he said he had carried from a craftsman in Vermont, hand-painted in the particular red that children seemed to respond to before they had opinions about anything else. He came back on Friday with a book of photographs of New York in the 1950s, because he had heard somewhere, he told Elena with that easy, unhurried smile, that she appreciated the city's older architecture. She had not told him that. She had not told Adrian that either, not in any conversation she could locate in memory, and yet she accepted the book, and thanked him, and placed it on the shelf, and told herself that men like Nikolai Volkov simply paid attention to the world in ways that ordinary people did not, that it was a family trait, that it meant nothing. She was becoming less convinced of her own explanations with each passing day, but she was not yet ready to stop offering them to herself. What made it harder was that she liked him. That was the part she had not prepared for, the part that sat most uncomfortably in the space between her instincts and her desire to be fair. Nikolai was funny in a way that did not perform itself, the kind of humor that arrived sideways in the middle of a serious sentence and left before anyone could pin it down. He spoke about his years in Chicago with the self-awareness of a man who understood he had been running from something without ever quite naming what. He asked about her father's company, not with the clinical curiosity she had grown used to from people who wanted to understand the collapse, but with the kind of careful, respectful attention that suggested he already knew the story mattered and was more interested in the person it had shaped. By Friday afternoon, she had told him 3 things about her father that she had not told anyone except Adrian, and she was aware of it, and she kept telling herself she was simply grieving, and that grief made people generous with strangers who asked the right questions. The moment she would return to later, picking it apart in the way she picked at things she had let pass too quickly, happened just after Nikolai left on Friday. She was gathering the cups from the table when she heard his car still in the drive, and through the window above the sink she saw him on his phone, turned slightly away from the house, and then Dr. Elias Wren's black sedan pulled through the outer gate. Dr. Wren was her obstetrician, the one who had delivered her son, who still visited the estate twice a week for postnatal checks that Adrian had arranged with the thoroughness he brought to every logistical decision about her health. She had assumed Adrian had found Dr. Wren through his own contacts. She had never asked. It had not occurred to her to ask because Adrian arranging things was simply the texture of her life now, and she had been too exhausted in those final weeks to interrogate the sourcing of her own medical care. Dr. Wren came through the gate and passed Nikolai on the drive, and Nikolai turned at the sound of the car, and what passed between the 2 men in that moment was not a wave and not a nod, but something more specific, the particular, minimal acknowledgement of 2 people who know each other well enough to communicate in the economy of shared history rather than the extravagance of greeting. Then Nikolai's car moved forward and Dr. Wren walked to the front door, and Elena was still standing at the sink with a cup in her hand and a very clear picture of something she could not yet name. She considered mentioning it to Adrian that evening. She turned the moment over through dinner, through the hour they spent on the sofa afterward with her son between them, through the particular quiet of the house settling around them at the end of the day. And each time she reached for the words, she found herself pulling back, not because she doubted what she had seen, but because she wanted to understand what she had seen before she gave it to anyone else, even him, especially him. She had learned, over the months they had been together, that Adrian processed information best when she brought him conclusions rather than observations, that he was trained to respond to facts and found ambiguity difficult to sit inside. She needed more facts first. She needed them to be hers before she could decide what to do with them. The following morning, Marcus came to the kitchen door while Adrian was on a call in the study. Elena was alone with her son and her coffee and the particular temporary piece of a baby who had just been fed and had not yet registered any new requirements. Marcus stood in the doorway with the expression she had come to associate with information he was deciding how much of to share, that narrow, careful compression of a man who had long ago learned that what he said mattered less than what he chose not to say. She offered him coffee and he declined, and then he stood for a moment longer than he needed to if he had nothing to tell her, and she waited because she had learned that waiting was frequently more productive than asking. "You had a good appointment yesterday," Marcus told her finally, meaning Dr. Wren's visit, and there was something in the way he phrased it, the mild, almost domestic quality of the observation, that told her it was not what he had come to the door to say. He left shortly after, and she sat with her son and thought about a man who had chosen that particular opening rather than whatever opening he had actually intended, and what that choice meant about what he knew and who he was protecting. She did not see Nikolai that day, but he called in the afternoon. She had not given him her number, and she had not asked Adrian if he had. She answered because the name on the screen was his, and she wanted to hear what reason he would give for having it. He asked how she was feeling, asked how the baby was sleeping, mentioned that he had found a pediatrician in the city who specialized in the kind of comprehensive early childhood care that Adrian would likely want for his son, and offered to make the introduction. She thanked him and told him she was happy with her current pediatric arrangement, which was a gentle way of saying she had not agreed to the arrangement he was proposing, and he accepted it with grace and said that he only wanted to be useful. After she set the phone down, she sat for a long time thinking about what useful meant to a man who already knew things he should not have known, and what it meant that he was offering her access to one more person he had apparently already selected. She called her father's former executive assistant that afternoon. Margaret had worked for her father for 22 years and knew the mechanics of institutional information gathering better than anyone Elena had ever met, which was why she had trusted her with the question she was not yet ready to ask Adrian: whether there was any public record linking Nikolai Volkov to any medical practice or healthcare investment in New York in the past decade. Margaret called back within 3 hours. There were 2 shell entities with Volkov family connections that had invested in a boutique medical services group, the kind that placed high-end private physicians with high-net-worth clients 3 years ago. Dr. Elias Wren had been part of that group's network before going into private practice. Elena wrote the information on a piece of paper, folded it, and placed it in the drawer of her nightstand, and then she sat with the weight of it for a very long time before deciding what came next. What came next was Adrian, returning from the city at 7:30 with the particular energy of a man who had spent the day managing problems he had not told her about. She watched him come through the door and cross the hall, and she thought about the car outside the gate and the so-sach that Nikolai knew, and the way Marcus had stood in the kitchen doorway with something he had decided not to say, and she thought about the promise they had made each other 3 weeks ago in this house, about decisions being made together, and she thought about how many small decisions had already been made around her, in parallel, by people who believed they were protecting her. She set her son down in the bassinet and went to find Adrian in the kitchen, and she leaned against the counter opposite him while he poured water from the pitcher, and she kept her voice entirely steady. "How did you find Dr. Wren?" she asked him. Adrian looked up, and the pause before he answered was not as long as the pause from the night with the car, but it was there, measurable, a fraction of a second in which his eyes moved and his expression recalibrated. "Through a medical referral service," he told her. "Marcus sourced it." "Why?" She watched his face for the rest of the answer, the part he had not spoken, and found what she was looking for in the stillness around his eyes, rather than in the answer itself. "Just curious," she told him, and turned to check on her son, and the paper in her nightstand drawer felt heavier than it had an hour ago. She lay awake long after Adrian slept, the paper in her mind if not in her hand, and she thought about a drawer that was not a metaphor anymore, but an actual piece of furniture 2 feet away containing an assize, actual piece of evidence. And she thought about the difference between the woman she had been a year ago, who would have waited for someone else to tell her what was happening in her own life, and the woman she intended to be now. She was going to need to look at this directly. She was going to need to be the one who looked first. The notebook was dark blue, small enough to fit in a jacket pocket, the kind that serious men carried when they did not trust their memory to hold everything they needed it to hold. Elena found it on Tuesday morning, wedged between the cushion and the arm of the sitting room sofa, which was where Nikolai had spent most of Sunday afternoon while Adrian took a call in the study, and Elena sat across from him with her son in her lap and let the conversation go wherever Nikolai steered it. She picked the notebook up without thinking, the way you picked up any object that had fallen out of place, and she was halfway to the side table where she intended to set it when the cover fell open at the pressure of her thumb, and she saw her name. Not a reference to her, not a note about her. Her full name, Elena Marchetti, written at the top of a page in a handwriting that was small and precise and entirely sure of itself, followed by a date she recognized as the week before her son was born, and below that date a second line that contained the name of the hospital, the name of the private wing, and the expected delivery window that Dr. Wren had told her and Adrian in a conversation that had taken place in this house with no one else present. She stood very still for a long moment. The sitting room had the particular morning quiet of a room that had been empty for hours. No sound from the study, no movement from upstairs where Adrian's security detail rotated through their shift change. Her son was in the bassinet in the kitchen, asleep, which meant she had perhaps 20 minutes before the world required her attention again, and she used the first 2 of those minutes simply standing with the notebook open and letting what she was looking at become real to her, rather than something she could still explain away. There was a second page behind the first. She turned to it. Dr. Elias Wren's name appeared at the top, below it a set of initials she did not recognize, and below those a date from 14 months ago, which was 4 months before she had ever become Dr. Wren's patient, which was 2 months before she had even met Adrian Volkov at a fundraising dinner in a room full of people who had no idea what they were standing next to. She closed the notebook. She set it on the side table where she had intended to set it. Then she went to the kitchen and stood over her sleeping son and looked at his face for a long time until her breathing steadied. She did not call Margaret this time. She did not make notes. She went to the hall closet and took her coat from the hook that Adrian's housekeeper kept for her, the second hook from the left, and she put it on. And she went to the kitchen and asked the security rotation's day shift man, whose name was Paul, and who had been stationed here long enough to know when she was about to do something. He would need to report whether someone could watch the baby for 2 hours while she ran an errand. Paul's expression performed neutrality, while his eyes did the calculation that all of Adrian's people did when she made unscheduled requests, and she told him she was going to the dry cleaner on Merchant Street, which was 3 blocks from Dr. Wren's private practice on the same avenue, and she watched Paul accept the explanation with the professional grace of a man who understood that his job was to accompany her, not to interrogate her. She did not go to the dry cleaner. Dr. Wren's receptionist told her the doctor was between patients and could give her 10 minutes, and the 10 minutes stretched into 25 because Elena had walked into the consultation room and closed the door and placed the folded piece of paper from her nightstand drawer on the desk between them before Dr. Wren had finished rising from his chair, and something in the way she did it made him sit back down. He was a careful man. She had always registered that about him, the particular caution of someone who understood that words had consequences and had trained himself to deploy them with precision. He looked at the paper, which contained Margaret's research, and he looked at Elena, and he made a decision about what kind of man he was going to be in the next 10 minutes that she could watch him making from across the desk. "How much do you already know?" he asked her, which was not a denial, which was the most useful thing he could have said. "Enough that I am here," Elena told him. "Tell me the rest." What he told her took less time than she expected because the truth, stripped of the infrastructure of deception that had been built around it, was not complicated. Nikolai Volkov had contacted him 18 months ago through the medical services network, before Elena existed in Dr. Wren's professional life, before she existed in Adrian's life, by any account she had been given. Nikolai had explained that his brother was a private individual with significant security concerns, whose partner, when the time came, would require a physician who understood discretion at the level required by men in Adrian's position. Dr. Wren had accepted the arrangement because the arrangement was not, on its surface, unreasonable. Men like Adrian Volkov did require physicians who understood discretion. He had not been asked to do anything improper. He had simply been placed, months in advance, in the position of being the physician Adrian's people would find when they looked for one. And when Adrian's people looked, Elena asked, very quietly. Dr. Wren acknowledged that Marcus had contacted the medical services network, that the network had put forward 3 names, that his had been among them. He had disclosed nothing to Nikolai about her care. He wanted her to understand that. He had treated her with complete professional integrity. He had simply been the physician in the right place because someone had arranged for him to be there. He arranged everything before I even knew Adrian existed, Elena told him, not as a question. Dr. Wren confirmed it and did not look away from her when he did. Paul drove her home because she did not trust her own concentration on the road, and she sat in the back of the car with her hands in her lap and assembled the architecture of what she now knew. Nikolai had identified Adrian as a man who would eventually have a child. He had placed a physician in his brother's life 14 months ago. He had known her name before she gave birth. He had known the expected delivery date from a conversation held in a room with only 3 people in it, which meant either the house had been listening or Dr. Wren had reported back despite what he had just told her, or there was a third explanation she had not yet found. He had offered to introduce her to a pediatrician. He had offered warmth and family and the particular tenderness of an uncle meeting a nephew, and all of it had been the surface of something built long before she arrived. She thought about the wooden horse painted in the red that children responded to before they had opinions. She thought about the book of photographs of a city whose architecture she apparently appreciated. She thought about her father and the stories she had told Nikolai about him, and felt something cold and precise move through her that was not grief and was not anger, but was the specific feeling of understanding arriving all at once, that you had handed something precious to someone who had known exactly how to ask for it. Adrian was in the front hall when she came through the door, which told her that Paul had communicated her return with the efficiency her absence had apparently warranted. He looked at her face, and whatever he found there rearranged his own expression in a way she recognized. The shift from the controlled composure of a man managing his day into the more unguarded attention of a man who understood that something had changed while he was not looking. She walked past him into the sitting room and picked up Nikolai's notebook from the side table where she had left it that morning, and she brought it back to the hall and placed it in Adrian's hand. She watched him look at it. She watched him open it. She watched the particular quality of his stillness shift from the version that meant he was thinking into the version that meant he already knew, had known something adjacent to this, and was now holding the specific evidence of how far adjacent had been from the actual truth. "How long?" she asked him, her voice carrying none of the anger she had a right to and all of the exhaustion she had been accumulating for 11 days. "Have you known that something was wrong with Nikolai?" He did not answer immediately. He closed the notebook. He held it in both hands the way people held objects when they needed something to do with their hands while their mind worked through what their mouth was going to say. And she watched him come to the decision that there was no version of this conversation where the answer was anything other than the full truth, and she watched him arrive at that decision without her having to demand it, which was perhaps the only thing in the past 3 weeks that had gone the way she needed it to go. "Since the night of the car," he told her. "Marcus gave me a name attached to the registration. The rental traced back to a company I recognized. I told myself there was an explanation that wasn't what it looked like." He met her eyes and held them. "I was wrong to tell myself that, and I was wrong not to tell you." She looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had promised her partnership and had reached for protection instead, when the fear became specific enough to touch, and she felt the weight of it. Not as betrayal. She knew the difference now between a man who deceived to harm and a man who deceived to shield, but as the cost of a pattern that they had not yet fully broken. "Call Marcus," she told him. "Call him right now, in this room, while I am standing here, and then we are going to sit down and you are going to tell me everything you know, and I mean everything, before you decide what to do with any of it." Adrian looked at her for 1 moment longer, and then he reached for his phone. The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours and covered more ground than she had known there was ground to cover, and when it was finished, the sitting room had grown dark around them, and her son was awake in the kitchen and requiring attention, and she rose to go to him and Adrian rose with her, and neither of them said anything for a while, because some things required the silence of a room that had just heard a great deal of truth to settle properly before any next step could be taken clearly. Nikolai arrived the following evening at 7, which was when Adrian had asked him to come, and he arrived alone, which told Elena that he already knew the texture of what was waiting for him and had decided that whatever position he intended to take, he would take it without the buffer of other people in the room. She watched him come through the front door from the top of the stairs, still in his coat, unhurried, carrying the particular composure of a man who had been preparing for this conversation for longer than anyone else in the house had known it was coming. Adrian waited for him in the study with the door open, and Nikolai walked toward it the way he walked through every room, as though the space had been expecting him. Elena came down the stairs quietly and stood in the hall outside the study and did not go in. Not yet. She needed to hear how Nikolai opened before she decided when to enter, because the way a man opened a conversation he knew was about him told you more than anything he said after. "You found the notebook," Nikolai observed, and his voice carried no surprise and no apology, only the measured acknowledgement of a man moving a piece on a board that had been in play for some time. Adrian's response did not come immediately, and she recognized the silence as the one he used when he was choosing between several true things and deciding which one to lead with. 14 months, Adrian told him finally. "You placed Ren 14 months before she was even my patient, before I knew she existed. You want to explain to me how long you have been planning around my life without telling me." There was a sound of movement, one of them crossing the room, and then Nikolai's voice again, lower now, carrying the register of a man who had decided that sincerity was his strongest available position. "I planned around your future, not your life. There is a difference, Adrian, and I need you to let me explain it before you decide what it means." Elena moved to the doorway. She did not knock and she did not announce herself, because she was not a guest in this house and she was not interrupting a private conversation. She was stepping into a room where her own life was being discussed, and she had earned the right to do that without permission. Both men looked at her. Nikolai's expression adjusted with the swift, practiced grace of a man recalibrating, not alarmed, not caught, simply shifting his approach the way a chess player shifts when the board changes. Adrian's expression was the one she had come to think of as his most honest, the one where the control was still present but the warmth underneath it was closer to the surface than he usually allowed. She took the chair across from where Nikolai stood, and she looked at him with the particular directness of a woman who had spent 11 days gathering information and was finished being patient. "You said you wanted to explain the difference," she told Nikolai, "between planning around his future and planning around his life. I would like to hear that explanation too, and I would like you to explain it without the version of it you would offer to someone who hasn't already spoken to Dr. Wren." Something shifted in Nikolai's face then, small but visible, the first genuine reaction she had seen from him that was not curated. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not entirely without respect, and then he moved to the chair across from hers and sat, and the three of them occupied the corners of the room with the study's lamp throwing a circle of warm light across the space between them. "Damien is 20 years old," Nikolai began, and his voice had changed, the easy confidence replaced by something quieter and more effortful, the voice of a man carrying something heavy rather than performing the absence of weight. "He has been the heir to this family's future since he was 4 years old, not because I chose it arbitrarily, because Adrian had made clear, for years, that he had no intention of building a family of his own, because the work of maintaining what our father built requires a next generation, and Damien is brilliant and he is ready, and I have spent 20 years making him ready." He paused, and the pause was not strategic. It was the pause of a man finding the honest version of something he had rehearsed in a less honest form. "And then you appeared," he told Elena, not unkindly. "And within 8 months my brother had a son, and everything I had built for Damien became conditional in a way it had never been before. So you placed a doctor in my life before I had a life to place him in," Adrian told him, and his voice was not raised, which was more frightening than if it had been. "You built an infrastructure around a child you hadn't yet decided what to do with, That is what you are describing. Nikolai met his eyes without flinching. I built a contingency, he told him. I built a way to understand what was happening before it happened to me. Ren was information. The car outside your gate was information. I was not planning harm, Adrian. I was planning awareness. The word landed in the room and Elena let it sit for a moment before she spoke, because she wanted it to have the weight it deserved. You were planning awareness, she repeated, and her voice was very level. The voice she had used for the worst meetings of her professional life, the ones where she had needed to be the calmest person in the room, while everyone else was losing the thread. You placed a physician in a position to attend my delivery. You had someone watch this house from the street for 3 weeks after my son was born. You used my grief about my father to build a relationship with me that I believed was genuine, and you did all of it in the name of awareness. She watched his face. What exactly were you going to do with what you became aware of? The silence that followed was the longest of the evening. Nikolai looked at his hands briefly, a gesture she had not seen from him before, the first time he had looked anywhere other than directly at the person he was addressing, and she understood that she had arrived at the question he had not fully answered even for himself. I wanted you to leave, he told her, and the honesty of it was so unadorned that it landed harder than anything more elaborate could have. Not through force, not through harm. I wanted you to understand, over time, that this world was not one you had chosen and not one that would make your son's life easier, and I believed that if you understood that clearly enough, you might choose to build your life somewhere outside it, somewhere where Damien's position would not need to be reconsidered. He looked up and met Elena's eyes. I was never going to hurt you. Adrian's voice, when it came, was the quietest she had ever heard from him, and the most dangerous in exactly that proportion. You are going to remove her from my life through attrition, through carefully placed doubt, through making her feel watched and uncertain and unsupported until she decided on her own that she didn't belong here. He stood, and the movement was slow and deliberate, the movement of a man who had made a decision and was taking the time to be certain of it before he acted on it. You used the one thing you knew I could not see clearly. You used the fact that I have spent 15 years carrying guilt about you, about what happened after father died, about the fact that you took the harder road while I built the visible empire, and you used every ounce of that guilt to stand in this house and smile at my son and dismantle my family from the inside. Nikolai did not deny it. He sat with the accusation in the way that only a man who understood its accuracy could sit with it, still and without deflection, and the quality of that stillness was the most honest thing he had offered all evening. I thought I was protecting my son, he told Adrian. I know that is not enough. I am not offering it as justification. I am offering it as the truth of why. Elena spoke then, before Adrian could respond, because there was something she needed to say that was hers to say, and not his. I know what it is to protect someone so hard that you stop asking whether the protection is the thing they need, she told Nikolai. Your brother taught me that, and I learned something from it that I think you have not yet learned, which is that protecting someone by removing their choices is not protection. It is just a quieter kind of control. She held his gaze until she was certain he had heard her, not just the words but the weight behind them. Your son deserves a future. He also deserves a father who did not build that future on the erasure of someone else's child. Nikolai looked at her for a long moment, and she watched something move through his expression that was not defeat and was not capitulation, but was something rarer and more difficult, the look of a man encountering a version of his own actions that he had not allowed himself to see until someone named it, without anger. Adrian moved to the desk and placed both hands flat on its surface, a posture she recognized as his concluding one. Here is what happens now, he told his brother, and his voice had recovered the cold precision that meant the emotional part of the conversation was finished and the structural part had begun. You will withdraw every person and every arrangement you have placed in proximity to Elena and my son, every contact, every positioned resource, every contingency that runs through your network. You will do this completely, and you will do it in a way that Marcus can verify. In exchange, I will not dismantle what you have built in Chicago, because Damien did not choose his father's methods, and he should not pay for them. He looked at Nikolai across the desk with the expression of a man who had arrived at the far side of a long and difficult reckoning. But you will not come into this house again until Elena decides she wants you here. Not me, her. That is the condition, and it is not negotiable. Nikolai looked at his brother for a long moment, and then he looked at Elena, and she held his gaze without offering him anything to interpret, because the decision about whether this was a door or a wall belonged entirely to her, and she was not ready to make it yet. He rose from his chair. He retrieved his coat from the back of it. He paused at the door of the study and turned back, and when he spoke, his voice carried the particular exhaustion of a man who had held something heavy for a very long time and was only just beginning to understand what it had cost him. I built everything I built for Damien, he told them. I would like you to believe that, even if you cannot forgive it. Elena let the statement settle in the room without responding to it, because some things did not require a response to be heard. And Nikolai Volkov walked out of the study and through the front hall and out of the house, and the door closed behind him with a quiet finality that felt nothing like an ending and everything like a reckoning that had only just begun to understand its own shape. Adrian stood at the desk for a moment after his brother left, his hand still flat on its surface, and Elena watched him from her chair across the room, watching the composure return to him, the way color returns to a face after a shock, slowly, unevenly, real. She rose and crossed the room and stood beside him, and he turned and looked at her with the expression she had first seen in the hospital room 3 weeks ago, the one that had no calculation in it at all. I should have seen it, he told her. I am the one who taught myself to watch every door, and I missed the one that mattered most because I was the one who built it. She placed her hand against his jaw the way she had once before, in a car moving through the city at night, when he had told her about his mother and she had wanted him to feel that she had heard him. You saw it when it counted, she told him. We both did. He covered her hand with his, and they stood there in the lamp-lit study while the house settled around them, and outside the far gate the street was empty, and the silence was only silence. 3 days passed before either of them brought up Nikolai again, and in those 3 days the house breathed differently, the way a room breathes after a window has been opened in it for the first time in a long season. Elena noticed it in small things, the quality of the quiet at breakfast, which had always been a comfortable quiet but was now something more deliberate, 2 people choosing the same silence, rather than occupying it separately. She noticed it in the way Adrian moved through the estate in the evenings, less of the controlled, corridor-to-corridor efficiency she had grown accustomed to reading as purposefulness, more of the unhurried, room-to-room presence of a man who had decided that being somewhere mattered as much as doing something while he was there. She noticed it most in the way he sat with their son, which he had always done with the focused tenderness of a man slightly astonished by his own capacity for gentleness, but which had taken on, in the days since Nikolai's visit, an additional quality she could only describe as relief, as though something that had been held at a careful distance had been permitted, at last, to simply be close. On the 4th morning, she found him in the kitchen before she came downstairs, which was unusual because Adrian's schedule ran early and precise, and the kitchen was typically hers alone in the hour before her son woke. He had made coffee without being asked, and had set a cup on the counter at the spot where she always stood, and he was leaning against the opposite counter, reading something on his phone with the loose, early morning posture of a man who was not performing anything for anyone. She picked up the cup and stood across from him and let the morning settle around them for a moment before either of them spoke. Marcus confirmed last night, Adrian told her, without looking up from the phone immediately. Everything Nikolai positioned has been withdrawn. Ren received a formal notification, ending his arrangement with the network. The car hasn't been back. He set the phone face down on the counter. It's done. She nodded, and held the warmth of the cup in both hands, and thought about what done meant in the world that she now lived in, which was not the same thing done meant in the world she had grown up in, and whether that difference was something she had made peace with or was still in the process of making peace with, one morning at a time. "I want to talk about something," she told him, and he looked at her with the full, unguarded attention that she had come to understand was his most reliable form of love, the kind that did not require a gesture or a grand statement, but simply the orientation of his entire self toward whatever she was about to say. "Not about Nikolai, about us, about what I want the next year to look like." He waited, because he had learned, in the months since their argument about the security detail, that waiting was the most useful thing he could offer her when she was assembling something she had been thinking about for a while. She set her cup down. "I want to go back to work. Not full-time, not yet. But the foundation has a program I've been consulting on for 8 months, and it needs more than part-time attention. I want to bring in a pediatric nurse to help during the hours I'm working. Someone I choose, vetted by whoever you need to vet them, but chosen by me. I want the security arrangement we agreed on, the 2-person rotation, not expanded unless there is a specific and identified reason to expand it that we discuss together before it happens." She watched his face through all of it, and his face did not shift into the careful composure she had learned to read as the exterior of disagreement being managed. It stayed open, attentive, the face of a man who was genuinely listening rather than constructing his response while she spoke. "Those are not requests," she finished. "They are how things are going to be. I am telling you so that we are doing this together. But I have decided." Adrian was quiet for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved in the way that was not quite a smile but was the precursor to one, the small involuntary movement of a man who had encountered something that pleased him before his composure had time to moderate the reaction. "The nurse," he told her. "I'd like Marcus to run the background check, but you make the final call." She acknowledged this. "The foundation work," he continued. "I'll have the car available whenever you need it. You tell me the schedule, not the other way around." She acknowledged this too. He reached across the counter and picked up his coffee and looked at her over the rim of it with an expression that was fully, quietly warm. "I like that you decided," he told her. "I like that you told me after." She allowed herself to smile at that. And the morning continued in its unhurried way, and her son announced his requirements from the bassinet in the next room, and the day began the way she was increasingly learning to prefer her days, not arranged around contingencies and threat assessments, but around the ordinary, irreplaceable business of being alive inside a life she recognized as her own. The naming ceremony happened on a Saturday, 11 days after Nikolai walked out of the study. Elena had organized it herself, which meant it was small and deliberate, and contained exactly the people it needed to contain and none of the people it did not. Margaret came, which Elena had wanted because Margaret had known her father long enough to carry something of him into the room simply by being there. Marcus came, which Adrian had wanted, and which Elena had agreed to without reservation, because Marcus had stood in a kitchen doorway with something he had not known whether to say, and had chosen, in his careful way, to stay close rather than to step back, and she had not forgotten that. A woman named Vera, whom Elena had met through the foundation, who had become, in the quiet accumulating way of genuine friendship, the closest thing to a best friend Elena had built in this city since her father's company collapsed and her world rearranged itself around the space the loss had left. And the 4 of them gathered in the sitting room where Nikolai had once left his notebook between the cushions, and the sunlight came through the tall windows in the particular Saturday morning way that made even familiar rooms look briefly extraordinary. And Adrian held his son, and Elena stood beside him, and they gave him a name, Luca. She had chosen it 3 weeks before the birth, and had not told anyone, not even Adrian, holding it privately the way she had learned to hold things that mattered most to her, close and quiet until she was certain of them. She had told Adrian the night after Nikolai's visit, in the lamplit study after the house had gone still, and he had sat with it for a long time before he spoke. And when he spoke, he told her that his mother's father had been named Luca, that it was a name he had loved without knowing he had been holding it somewhere all his life. and the coincidence of it had landed between them with the particular, unexpected weight of something that felt less like coincidence and more like the world aligning itself around a truth that had always been present. She had not known about Adrian's grandfather. He had not known she had chosen the name. And yet, there it was, the same name, arrived at separately, which was perhaps the most honest thing she could imagine about who they were to each other. Luka Volkov. She said it aloud for the first time in the sitting room, surrounded by 5 people who had each, in their separate ways, chosen to be present in her life rather than convenient to it, and the name filled the room with a particular solidity of something that had finally, after a great deal of waiting, been allowed to exist in the world. Adrian's expression when she said it was the one from the hospital, the one that had no calculation in it, the one that belonged only to this room and to her and to the small, now named person in his arms, who was regarding the ceiling with the serene indifference of someone who did not yet understand that anything significant was happening around him. Vera, who had met Adrian for the first time that morning, and who had the particular perceptive directness of a woman who had made her career reading institutions and the people inside them, leaned to Elena afterward and told her quietly that she understood now why Elena had spent 6 months being carefully private about this particular part of her life. Elena told her that she was still figuring out the edges of it herself. Vera told her that the edges were overrated, that the middle was where everything worth knowing about a life actually happened, and Elena thought about that for the rest of the afternoon, with the slow, iterative pleasure of an idea she intended to keep returning to. In the evening, after Margaret and Vera had gone and Marcus had checked the rotation and confirmed the night shift arrangements with the brevity of a man who had learned that his employer preferred efficiency to ceremony, and the estate had settled back into its particular quiet, Elena sat in the chair by the window in the room where Luka slept, and she looked out at the drive below and the gate and the empty street beyond it. No car. Only the ordinary city doing its ordinary late-evening business, unconcerned, continuous, indifferent in the way she had once found alienating and had come, over the months of this strange and demanding and irreplaceable year, to find almost comforting. The indifference of the city meant that what happened inside this house was theirs, not the city's, not Nikolai's, not Bradley's, not Caroline's, not the foundations or the boards or any of the other institutions that had claims on pieces of her time and her name and her history. The life inside this house was the one she had built, one careful decision at a time, and she had built it alongside a man who was still learning, as she was, that the difference between love and control was a line you had to choose every day to stay on the right side of. Adrian appeared in the doorway behind her, and she heard him rather than saw him, the particular sound of his presence in a room that she had memorized the same way she had memorized the weight of his hand against her back at the gala that first night, a physical fact that had become, in the way that physical facts sometimes do, the foundation of something larger. He crossed the room and stood behind her chair and looked out the window at the same street she was looking at, and she reached up without turning and found his hand where it rested on the back of the chair, and his fingers closed around hers with the unhurried certainty of a man who was exactly where he intended to be. "He's asleep," Elena told him, meaning Luka, meaning the small, named, permanent person in the bassinet 4 feet away who had changed every calculation either of them had been running. "Good," Adrian told her, meaning the same thing and also more than the same thing, meaning all of it. The named child and the empty street and the house that was quiet for the right reasons and the woman in, the chair whose hand he was holding, and the life they were both, slowly and honestly and without pretending it was simple, choosing to build together. Outside, the city continued. Inside, the silence was theirs, and Luka Volkov slept through all of it, unhurried and untroubled, in the particular peace of a child who did not yet know the world was complicated, held safe inside the life 2 people had fought and failed, and told the truth, and tried again to give him.